Good evening, everybody. It is I, Nick Pennsylvania, and I'm here this evening with my good friend Brendan Bond. How are you this evening, Brendan?
I'm doing excellent, Nick. How are you doing, bud?
I'm real good, and coming off like a high wave. Our last two episodes were just really big things for us, having interviews with a local author, Professor Thomas White, and somebody whose writing is newer to me, but you had lent me a book, and I've since gone out and purchased a couple. W.T. Watson, really great interviews, really good time. What were some of your thoughts and takeaways from that?
Yeah, just again, big thanks to both of those gentlemen for speaking with us the last few weeks. Really fascinating conversations. For how much me and you talk about this stuff and how many books and articles we read and other folks we talk to, there's just something about sitting down with someone who has dedicated as much time as both of them have to their craft of folklore and writing, and just you've mentioned before, Nick, the reverence for certain things.
Yes.
And just the reverence they have for the source material and the history and the people and what it means about our culture. Even though they both have very different backgrounds and different perspectives on things, that was the through line, I think, that was just it's just so invigorating talking to people like that. And they were just such, they're both very charismatic and very energetic and just so passionate that it's hard not to get kind of caught up in it whenever you're talking with them about some of these things.
Well, that's what I took away from too. Both guys were they were nice as could be.
Couldn't be nicer. Yeah.
A good bit of chatting before we started rolling microphones and everything too. And their continued enthusiasm for the topic was really was a really inspiring thing for me, because, I feel like in the circles that we run in together and independently, we are known for being the ones that has all these stories and whatnot. Right. And I felt just well overshadowed by both of them.
Just so much knowledge. Yeah. And it reminds you there's so much more out there. There's times where we think have we heard all the weird stories about just even our little neck of the woods here.
And then White comes up with the Northern Tier of Pennsylvania has this werewolf. How did I miss the werewolf folklore?
Exactly. So we're very excited about talking to him about that in the future, and both of them are still working on things, and certainly will not be the last time that you guys hear either one of them.
I hope not. I mean, when W.T. Travis Watson said something about we effectively live in the capital of high strangeness, did you take that as a sense of personal accomplishment or pride?
A little bit of a feather in our cap. It's you know what, you're right. It is pretty cool around here. But that was validating, because like I said in that conversation, there's times where you think oh, everyone is surrounded by this kind of history and folklore, and there's stories of witches, and there's Bigfoot in the woods, and there's all these kinds of things happening. And to hear from someone who has the perspective that Travis did, so oh, you guys are in a pretty decent hotspot. It's okay, so this is special, not unique, but it's special.
Yeah. And again, White talking about how this is a really rich area that we take for granted, not being kind of aware for collecting folktales. It was great time. I really enjoyed our conversations with both, and I wish we could have gone longer, but there's that knowledge that, both of them would like to come back, and we certainly want to talk to them again. And we really encourage, if you're listening, take a look at their books. Even Thomas White, again, he's fairly localized to Pennsylvania, but the books are just very well written and fascinating. I can't stress it enough. Check both of them out. That's Thomas White and W.T. Watson. It would help them and help yourself really to some fine reading.
Right. Yeah. And like I said, I think on both those episodes, I kind of fanboyed a little bit whenever talking to both of them initially, because again, reading so many of their books, and for how much folklore and stuff like this that we read, it's rare for me to come across an author. This has only happened a few times where you come across an author, you get 20, 30 pages in, and you just hop online and buy the rest of their books, you know, like right after.
Right.
It's just, so you're just like, oh, like this person gets it. Like this is a kindred spirit. And again, how they communicate the stories is just so accessible, whether you're already knowledgeable about the area or these stories, or it's your first book on this stuff.
Yeah. And before we get into today, I just want to do a few quick housekeeping sort of things. One, I do want to point out that I'm trying a different microphone setup. I had heard from a couple people that Bond's audio sounds really good, but I kind of sound like I'm in the bathroom at the time of recording, which is definitely not true. And Brendan Bond is here.
I can attest. Yeah.
So I am trying a different microphone setup. Please let me know how it sounds. And if you're listening, if you haven't yet, let us know how you think. Let us know what you think and how we're doing. And if you have ideas, if you've got a spooky story, feel free. If you go on whatever you're listening to us by way of, if you want to go ahead and give us a rating, we always get excited to read reviews. But the best thing that you can do for us and for yourself is to, if you are enjoying what you're listening to, let like-minded people know about it, to give us a chance, because the more people we have listening, the more stories we encounter, and the more stories that we encounter, the more stories we can discuss, the more new and vibrant guests that we can welcome to speak with us, and it just makes for everything to be better. So if you can do one thing, you know, if you could do me a favor, let somebody else know.
There you go.
But on the subject of there's just so many things that you don't know, you've got a few stories, and I'm trying to remember this right. I had never heard of. You had asked me, you've been doing some reading over the past few weeks, and you reached out and you said, have you ever heard of this character? And I said, no. And you said, well, I don't want you to look anything up. You should come into this cold. So it was at South Bay Bessie.
Yes.
Now, can I take a stab? And I swear I resisted the urge to look anything up. Based on some of the recent comments you've made, is this some sort of cryptid? Or is this some sort of witch lady?
No, it is a cryptid. It's, again, one that I had never heard of either. So no shame or anything there. How I came across it was I was looking at Erie Brewing Company, which is a local brewery over in Cleveland, and I saw that they had an Imperial IPA, which I enjoy, that was actually called the Lake Erie Monster. And I had always thought that Lake Erie didn't have any monsters. Like, you hear about Champ, we have the supposed serpent in Raystown. Whenever we were talking to W.T. Watson last week, you know, they talk about all the sea serpents up north, but I had never heard of anything in Lake Erie. So I started doing a little bit of research, and I came across, some people just call it the Lake Erie Monster, but it's more better known as South Bay Bessie, which is a really fun name. And when I came across that, I started doing some research. And the first thing I typed into Google was cryptids that are not real, because I wanted to get a list. And then I realized
what a strange thing to put in there.
Because in my head, like, how crazy does that make me sound? Like, Google is like, this guy is completely... Because what I was looking for is, I originally was like, oh, this must be a cryptid that is like a newer concoction by like a Bureau of Tourism that like no one actually believes in.
That makes sense. So maybe it's less believable, because I've heard the argument made that cryptology, or
cryptozoology or whatever.
cryptozoology, thank you, is
Yeah.
a self-defeating thing because the moment something's discovered and taxonomized, it ceases to be a cryptid.
Cryptid, exactly. Yeah, it's a, but just the idea of typing in cryptids that are not real. I was like, man, does that if that's not bias in your questioning, I don't know what is. Like,
I'm in agree with you.
I was just like, man, I need to take a step back. But so I started doing some research, and I quickly found there actually was a serious history here and a bunch of stories. And I was just kind of like, oh man, like as someone who really enjoys Lake Erie, and I know Lake Erie is big. It, goes the whole way from Buffalo to up into Detroit, basically. When I think of Lake Erie and I think of Erie, I think of the town and coastline here in Pennsylvania. So I'm going to use a lot, when I say Erie as a place and Erie as a body of water, I'm going to use this kind of interchangeably. But I do understand that it is a much larger area. But I really enjoy Erie and the lake, and I've had a lot of really good times up there. And I was shocked that I had never heard of this apparent cryptid.
Well, and I spent just last summer, my wife, daughter, and I went up to Presque Isle for a weekend. And of course, I've been in Erie. Well, there was a time for the better part of 8 years, I was staying at least a couple days in Erie, the city of,
Right.
once a month for at least a couple days. And oftentimes I would be up for a few more hours. I have to go up there for work quite frequently. And that's only about an hour and a half from where I'm at. So I would often stay, and we've had friends that lived there. And when I was a young kid playing hockey, and in college playing hockey, I was up in Erie a lot, of course. We still go to OHL games. And the bottom line is we spent a good weekend on Presque Isle last summer, did the lighthouse thing, and didn't hear a single story of this. We went to the Maritime Museum, didn't hear a single story about this.
Right. So, yeah, so we spent between the both of us, we spent quite a bit of time up there doing a lot of different things. So the fact that we had never heard of this was surprising, which made me all the more curious. So I started looking into it, and what South Bay Bessie apparently is it is your quintessential lake monster, where it is said to be a snake-like creature, 30 to 40 feet long, like a foot wide. And then the head is supposed to be kind of like of a dog or a horse. Some of the stories have it as like a plesiosaur, almost kind of like a Loch Ness monster. Or I guess even Champ is supposed to be a plesiosaur type creature. So depending on the story, it goes from snake-like creature to plesiosaur, and it all kind of gets lumped in together, which we see a lot with these lake monster type creatures. Not exactly the most original thing. And again, I'm like, oh, this is just is what it is, kind of thing. But I started looking and found on quite a few places quite a few stories, and a lot of them are just very kind of quick snippets that were, as anyone who's done paranormal research on the internet knows, you find a lot of the same stuff on a lot of different sites that has all kind of linked to it, all kind of cite each other. So this kind of falls into that category. But then I did find a longer first person interview that I'll get to after that. But I want to just give you kind of these short, quick hit stories that come from various news articles. So let's just start rattling some of these off. 1793.
That's going back a lot farther than I was, because earlier when you started, I was going to interrupt you and ask you how far back it went.
Right. I was expecting 1993. But no.
I was expecting something, because again, we know there's supposed stories of Loch Ness Monster going back prior to that.
Right.
But this is really not that much. This is kind of contemporary than that. It's not something that came out when, there were all the big thing about Loch Ness Monster in the 30s and 40s. It didn't come out after that. Okay.
Right.
Interesting. Sorry for the interruption.
Yeah,
That was earlier than I anticipated.
That was my first reaction too. So 1793, the captain of the ship Felicity was steering his sailboat through the shallows of Lake Erie's islands down on like the Western Shore, duck hunting and admiring the rugged natural beauty of the area. As he was shooting at some of the ducks over the water, the captain saw something and said that it was an enormous serpent that started thrashing around and near his boat, presumably startled by the gunshots. Where it said the creature was huge, easily over 5 meters long, and it disappeared before he could get a better look at it. Then, just a few years later, in July of 1817, a crew in a schooner reported a 30 to 40 foot long serpent that was dark in color. Later that same year, another boat crew spotted a very similar animal, except this time it was copper colored and apparently 60 feet. It was shot at with muskets, but no damage was reported. That same year, 1817, another incident took place down near Toledo with some French trappers. Two brothers with the name, I'm not going to butcher it, but it's Dusseau. How would you pronounce that in French?
Let me see. Wait, spell that again.
Dusseau.
Oh, Dusseau.
Dusseau. There we go. I'm awful at French, so encountered
Dusseau.
Dusseau, yeah. So the Dusseau brothers encountered a monster on the beach, writhing in what looked to be death throes. They said that the creature seemed to be 20 or 30 feet in length, shaped like a large sturgeon, except that it had arms, like human arms. The panicked brothers fled, and when they returned later, the creature had disappeared, presumably carried off by the waves or to its death. All that was left was the presence of marks on the beach and a number of silver scales about the size of silver dollars. Just to kind of take a break there before I read these next few, sturgeon is the first thing that I think a lot of people think of when they think of, okay, if there's something huge in the water that people might be running into, white sturgeon, which I'm not sure if technically they still are in Lake Erie. I know historically they were. White sturgeon can get huge. Like, I'm not sure if 30 feet if they can get 30 feet long, but I'm sure they can get 20 feet long. I know the ones they have over in the Nordic countries are like monsters.
Well, and they can live forever too. That's another thing.
Yeah, and I mean, they're well over 1,000 pounds. They're very, very big animals. Even if you're used to being in the water, seeing something that size, especially in shallow water, especially if an animal like that is in distress, it might move to shallow water, and could be confused with something. So I'm the whole time I'm reading this, I'm thinking, oh, it's a sturgeon. But then in this in this story, they say the thing had human arms, and it's like, what in the world are these guys looking at? But I think it's interesting that sturgeon has been brought up already in these stories. It's something that they thought that it was, but clearly said that it wasn't. I think that's important.
Well, there's also pike.
Right, pike can be huge. And again, they look really menacing, and they're violent.
And I'm trying to think, one of the species of pike that is no longer around in Lake Erie, to the best of my knowledge, is the blue pike. I mean, there's a northern pike, which I think is more abundant, but the blue pike, I'm trying to remember, and if I recall, they could get pretty big, not 20 to 30 feet big.
But big.
But the way their fins are too, I could imagine like damaged fins on one of those.
If they were hurt or sick. Yeah.
Right. So I could imagine that kind of looking not unlike. And again, I don't know. I don't know how to think, because you would figure that people knowing the waters and whatnot would be accustomed to such things. But I'll tell you what, I remember being a kid, there was a pond in my backyard, as you well know, and my life revolved around it, because in the winters, I'd be out there playing hockey when I wasn't in a proper ice rink playing hockey, and in the summers, we would catch frogs and turtles there and everything, and it wasn't a huge pond, but it was a good size. There were carp in that pond, and I have a specific memory that I'll probably die recollecting, and It was early one morning. The dew was still out on the grass. It was early mid spring, maybe mid April. And I was just walking the perimeter of the pond, and there was a treed side, there was a bushy side, and then there were two long, pretty open sides. And
Yeah.
on one of the long open sides, I thought I saw a log sticking out of the pond, which, was, I didn't know how that got there. But as I was walking up to the log, I was maybe 4 feet, 5 feet from it when it shunk right back into the water. It was one of those big carp just sitting on the side, sticking like half out of the water.
Right.
Scared the hell out of me.
Right.
and I knew what it was. It's just yeah, but I knew what it was. I didn't mistake it for anything other than when I thought it was a log at first. It's just I don't know. These are pretty wild stories, but at the same time, like I could imagine. I don't know. I'm sure you're looking up like how large can North American sturgeon get.
Yeah.
Okay, so there was the largest sturgeon on record was a beluga female, captured Volga Delta. I'm assuming that's in Scandinavia.
I'm sure.
I will confirm that. It was 23 feet 7 inches.
Jeez.
So I mean
that's a big creature. I mean, it's not 30 feet, obviously, but 20.
The Volga Delta is in northwestern Caspian Sea. So okay, it's a large river system. Oh, the Volga River. Oh my god.
Okay. But yeah, so they can get pretty darn big. And again,
it's conceivable that one in Lake Erie got larger than that.
Right, especially historically, you never know. Not a crazy thing. Now it gets crazier from here.
I'm all ears.
Right. An extraordinary sighting, which was carried by local newspapers, took place by the entire crew of a ship bound for Buffalo, New York, from Buffalo, New York to Toledo, Ohio in 1892. So we're getting a little more contemporary here. The crew, including the captain, saw a large area of water about half a mile ahead of them, churned up and foaming. As they approached, they saw a huge sea serpent that appeared to be wrestling about in the water as fighting an unseen foe. End quote. They observed as the creature relaxed itself and stretched to a full length of 50 feet. It appeared to be about 4 feet in circumference around. With a head sticking above the water an additional 4 feet, the brownish creature's eyes were described as viciously sparkling, and large fins were also noted. That's a pretty harrowing one.
I think that's reading a lot into this fish's stare.
Right, exactly. Like, as someone who's looked at a lot of fish close up, like vicious is never a word that I would have used.
But I will say that the one thing that seems to be stated in a lot of these stories thus far is the thrashing about aspect of it.
Right.
So I wonder if these weren't actually, okay, I know I'm being overly skeptical and I should just listen to the stories, but I wonder if this wasn't a couple of these sturgeon or pike or something like that. Right. Because, well, I mean, you've seen that we know the mating habits of trout.
Right.
More than we should, really. Right. And okay, I'll go on.
Yeah, but so there's definitely other things that these things could be mistaken for, I think, in certain situations. So sticking with the late 19th century, Crystal Beach near Fort Erie was the scene of another sighting on May 5th, 1896. This time there were 4 eyewitnesses that watched for 45 minutes as a 30-foot long creature with a dog-shaped head and a pointy tail churned up the water as it swam about until finally disappearing before nightfall. So that one's interesting for the 45-minute part. Like, that's a long time to observe any wild animal.
That's long enough to get bored of
right,
a novelty
exactly.
like that.
Yeah, exactly. Even if it's something you were like going to look at. Yeah, I mean, okay, then we have one more contemporary one before we get to the this one longer one I found. In the 1980s, two women spotted the Lake Erie monster, as it's called in this one. I'm not going to use the people's names, though they are mentioned here. A woman from Akron and a woman from Erie described the creature as a reptilian and snake-like with big flippers, much like those of a plesiosaur. So I think that's where the plesiosaur stuff comes from. According to this one woman, the creature was so large that it could have easily capsized a boat, and it seemed to be playing. Luckily for the women, Bessie was more interested in frolicking in Lake Erie's waves and overturning boats that day. That's a little more contemporary one. And then I have a longer one that I found and this explains why I had never seen it before. Because for a lot of us, most people I know have the weird Pennsylvania book that came out 15, 20 years ago. We've referenced it here on the show before. It is full of, it's a great like primer book for weirdness in a state. But there's one for each state, apparently, which I didn't know. I thought it was just Weird Pennsylvania. But apparently there's a Weird USA. It was a whole like franchise. So this I found in Weird Ohio was a interview that one of the writers did with a witness. So I'm going to go ahead and just dive into this. Again, this is from Weird Ohio. I wish I could do a good like Ohio fisherman accent. Oh, okay. That's a missed opportunity there. I have a boat on Lake Erie and I often fish near Vermilion. And I can tell you that there is a monster in that lake near that shore. Many people have seen it over the years, and I am one of those people. The first thing I will say is that I know the town of Huron has tried to make money off of this monster. They call it Bessie and try to get tourists to come out and look for it. They think that it's and I think that it is very irresponsible and downright dangerous. The thing I saw was vicious and dangerous. Giving it a cute name and trying to get people, let alone kids, to come and search for it is only going to lead to a tragedy. I'm a fishing fanatic. I've got a 18-foot Boston whaler and some friends that I use consistently in the summer. I'm sorry. That's not type.
Some friends that use this for bait to try to attract us.
Yeah, I think what they mean in this is that they use the Boston whaler in the summers. Pretty much every weekend or a free day that I'm not working, I'm out on Lake Erie. 2 summers ago, I was out in the lake more than usual. I had just gone through a pretty messy divorce, lost custody of my kid, and was in danger of losing my job. I was having a lot of trouble sleeping and found myself spending most of those sleepless nights alone on my boat, either fishing or just cruising the lake, thinking about how rotten my life was. In early July, I was having one of those nights where I was just cruising the lake. I anchored the boat a few hundred yards offshore and was just laying on my back, drinking a few cans of beer. As sad as it is in hindsight, I found the combination of the rocking of the boat and a few beers to be one of the surefire methods of overcoming my insomnia. That's fair. I don't know how many mornings that summer I woke up fully clothed on the deck of my boat with cans scattered about. It was not the happiest period of my life.
Is this Jimmy Buffett?
I know, it sounds like a Buffett song. This particular night, I was awakened from my slumber by something rubbing up against the bottom of the boat. The noise and the impact woke me, and I immediately heard the noise that I find hard to describe. It was the rushing of water followed by the slap of something against the surface of the lake. I sprang up and grabbed the lantern, which I always left burning in the bow of the boat so that no other vessels would plow into me at night. Then I lunged to the gunwale and held the light over the water to have a look. What I saw, I will never forget. Before I go any further, let me say that I was not drunk when I saw what I saw. I had been sleeping for at least 3 hours and had only had 4 beers. I am sure what I'm about to describe is in no way the product of any alcohol-induced hallucination. There was a long, thick creature a few feet beneath the keel of my boat. All exaggeration aside, this thing was at least 20 feet long. It darted with an incredible speed away from my skiff as I struggled to make out its form beneath the inky black surface of the water. When it was about 30 feet from my vessel, the beast reared up out of the lake. Although it was still dark out, it was clear enough with the full moon shining down on the surface of the lake. Because of this fact, I was able to clearly make out the long serpentine body of the animal, its large round head. That was all I saw before it submerged again and disappeared forever. There is no doubt in my mind that the thing intentionally slammed into my boat. The first instinct I had when I saw it was that I invaded its territory and it was letting me know. Perhaps like a common eel, it had been attracted to the glow of my lantern. I cannot say for sure, but it was the last night I ever spent alone on Lake Erie. I've gone fishing at night a few times in the past few years and never by myself. Needless to say, the sleeplessness of that summer only got worse after I looked that monster in the eye. My life has returned more or less to normal. I've remarried, I see my kid often, and have a new job much better than one I was so worried about back then. When I think back on that summer, the only really terrific aspect of it I haven't managed to reckon with is the mystery of what I saw that night. I think that's a pretty wild story. What are your initial thoughts hearing that?
Well, one, I was looking up how big do eels get in the Great Lakes. Apparently, they can get about 7 feet.
That's pretty.
But if I'm to take everything at face value, this seems like a pretty credible person because, okay, we've kind of mentioned some of the larger fish on Lake Erie known today. The northern pike, that you mentioned, the sturgeon. There's also one we didn't think of yet, which was the long-nosed gar.
Is there gar in Erie?
Yeah, the long-nosed gar, not alligator gar,
right?
Which are even more like if you're going to ascribe the title of vicious to the gaze of a fish, an alligator gar will do it, but the long-nosed gar is in Lake Erie, so they can get pretty big too, but not 20 feet. So again, judging, I don't care what this guy says, 4 beers, but if I take everything at face value, I should be able to safely assume that this is a person pretty familiar with the typical fish that are in the lake.
Mm-hmm.
So, that's a pretty weird one. That's a pretty interesting story. I don't know what to say other than it clearly, if this guy truly is not out on the lake at night unless he's with somebody else as a direct result of this incident, that's more than just a startling occasion.
For sure. Yeah. No, I agree. And it's one of those things where that story just for some reason rings true. And again, that's just a complete gut reaction, but I believe this guy.
Here's one thing I do have to say though. He talks about, and I don't know what his angle is on this, but he talks about in the beginning, it opens up with they're doing tours to try to find this thing. Well, I don't think that's a big deal because there is so much boating on Lake Erie, and traditionally there was a lot of commercial traffic too, and that's still a thing, and throughout all the Great Lakes,
right?
So my whole thing is this thing is elusive enough that even though we have, and this just might be routine aberrations of an unusually large fish, or because unless I guess sturgeon can live forever, so it's I suppose technically if there were a giant singular being, it could still be that same one from the 18th century. Bottom line is it's elusive enough and it's a rare enough occurrence that this guy only saw one experience. Of course, it was a really big experience, but there's all this leisure travel on the lake. There's the commercial travel on the lake.
Right.
There is a Coast Guard on the lake. And if this were something that we should be thoroughly worried about and saying, tornado chasing,
watch out.
This is right.
Yeah.
I think that's a bit exaggerated. And again, I didn't have this guy's experience, but it seems clear that this really, really frightened him and continues to do so if he's going to make a statement like that in the face of the high improbability that you're going to encounter this thing, if indeed it is real.
It is real, yeah. And it's interesting, I think, that this story brings up two things that on different ends of the spectrum that I thought about too. One, when he mentioned the light, that got me thinking of the gunshots in that very first one, and the idea that these fish are somehow attracted one way or the other. I'm saying fish. Something is being attracted
Yes.
for these encounters to happen. And that made me think of another fish that we hadn't talked about yet that lives in Lake Erie, that if I was not prepared and saw it in the wild, I know would scare the heck out of me.
Can I guess what it is?
Yes. Yes.
Is it the buffalo?
Are there buffalo in?
Big mouth buffalo. For those of you who have not, look up just a Google image of a big mouth buffalo fish. But no, okay, so it's not the big mouth buffalo. What is it?
The fish I was thinking of was the paddlefish, which we do have in Erie, and some of the other rivers in Pennsylvania. Now they don't get huge. I think they maybe get like 6-7 feet.
Oh, I mean, 6-7 feet is huge, but
right, yeah, but yeah, I mean, not 20-30 feet, but I can see someone seeing a 7-foot paddlefish and thinking it is a 15-foot long whatever, like,
and I can see that
they're
getting
so wild looking. They're such a wild
they definitely
fish.
are. They are very similar. At least their heads and their nose, in particular, are very similar to that gar that I spoke of earlier.
Right.
But the big thing with the paddlefish is it's kind of flatter. It's not as snaky.
It's not snaky.
It's got this. It's just. It looks like a silver dollar with a giant nose.
Right. But what made me think of that fish was if he had since this guy had a light that might have attracted like zooplankton and phytoplankton, and these paddlefish that's what they feed on. They're gill, or they're what do they call them? Like strainer feeders, where they feed on zooplankton. So that light might have been like a dinner bell. Like it's like,
Yeah, you can kind of think of it like a whale almost,
right,
in that it swims around with its mouth open. And
right, exactly. So like, and again, that doesn't explain a lot of the other elements, but it's a weird fish that you wouldn't expect to see, that I could understand frightening somebody. Yeah,
and I said the big mouth buffalo, only because they can get pretty big.
Anything in that family that's like a carp, like is, if they can keep eating, they just get bigger and bigger and bigger. So
right.
it wouldn't take a lot for those to get huge. Now that does lead me to something that I found in connection with these stories. When I was looking for just different articles on, the Lake Erie monster, and specifically South Shore Bessie, I came across contemporary news articles about the Lake Erie chomper. Have you heard of this either?
No, but I'm gonna, right now in the Pittsburgh area, we have an alligator loose in the Kitsky River, supposedly, as we speak. Is this an alligator that supposedly got out? Because that, chomper is a decent name for an alligator.
It is. And by the way, I'm all about Pittsburgh alligators. I think they're here. I think that there's.
Have you been watching the news lately? Because there's been a few sightings lately in the Kiski area.
Well, and there's been sightings historically, and obviously they can't live through the winter. Obviously they have to be exotic pets or something. But just there's something about the idea of an alligator in the Three Rivers that just I don't know.
Well, it's happened.
Right.
It has happened, definitively.
Yeah, we've had alligators in the river. That doesn't mean they're
and again, it's people
it's paranormal.
Release pets. Yeah. People have released pets. It's the same thing why we're having to deal with not anacondas, but pythons in the Everglades.
Right.
Same sort of thing. Yeah.
Right. And that kind of leads into the Lake Erie chomper. So I found these references, and all the articles that I found were basically around these two instances. So I'm just going to read the snippets that I kind of found.
Sounds good.
The first attack was near the Port Dover pump house. In less than 24 hours, 2 swimmers were bitten. So what happened was a 47-year-old woman was headed to the beach for just, a swim. Calm water, everything was fine. She was only a few feet into the lake when she felt a bite on her calf. She frantically made
chomp, if you
a
would.
chomp, if you will. She made her way back to shore, and what they found was a 6-inch series of circular, like puncture wounds.
Wait,
it was obviously like jaw shaped, not
okay,
not like lamprey shaped.
That's exactly
That was
what
my
I was going to
first thought.
ask. Yeah.
Then the following morning, there was a father and son there at the same beach swimming. The child was attacked to the point where he did need to go to the hospital, had medical attention, had like stitches and everything. And what this turned out to, what the authorities said this was a snakehead or a bowfin.
Okay. Yes.
Which are an invasive species that we've been seeing more and more here in America.
Yes.
I believe they're South American initially.
It's
or are they
it's my
Asian?
they are Asian to the best of my memory. Right now, I don't believe the Pennsylvania authorities have any confirmation that they are in our waterways.
Right.
However, they have to be, or if they're not, it's only a matter of time. The reason I say they have to be is because they have been in the Chesapeake Bay water area for years now, because again, as fly fishing guys, there's been a bounty on them. Like if you would go to Maryland and catch them, and the Chesapeake Bay watershed actually extends into central Pennsylvania, all the way up into the Route 80 corridor there. And the wildest thing, one, these fish are evil looking. Yeah. They're pretty aggressive, and they can live outside of water for like 3 days. So with not having many, if any, no natural predators here, they can get into like a small water system, basically fill up like a buffet, and then they can leave the water and make their way to another body or somewhere. It's crazy.
It's nuts.
And
it's a real thing. And
if zebra mussels have already gotten around our waterways, then so can this.
Right. And it's one of those things where you hear that, and like the takeaway from this for me is that like when you look at like these like, you know, supposedly paranormal or cryptid creatures or like whatever, you come across something that is like undeniably a real thing. Like these two people were attacked, you know, and were bitten and, you know, had to suffer for it kind of thing. And like that's like undeniable. And like that's a scarier thing, because when I read these stories, I'm not worried about South Bay Bessie coming into my waterways and ruining my fishing habitat or attacking kids or animals or whatever, people. But these snakeheads you have to worry about. You know, that's a real concern.
And I just looked up, they are native to China.
Okay.
They can get up to 19 pounds, or we can see them sometimes exceed. They can get as large as nearly 3 feet and weigh the better part of 20 pounds.
I would not want to fight one.
No, and they are aggressive, and they do have very needly like teeth. Yeah, they will. Yeah, they're
basically a head and just a big fin that's all muscle.
Yeah, like, very eel-y like.
Right, but yeah, they're basically this little. But again, that's something you need to be legitimately concerned about. You know, like that's if you're not going to go in the lake, that's the thing you have to worry about. You know, I don't think South Bay Bessie should be a deterrent for anybody to enjoy Lake Erie.
Now, because really, what is Bessie? Again, if they are real, what has Bessie done other than thrash about? And dance in the water and surprise you.
Yeah, apparently in the one story, even frolicking.
Right, and then another story may have helped some guy set his life straight.
Right, and it's funny because that's when that does kind of get into the paranormal side of things, when we talk about people being in liminal times in their lives and liminal spaces, and suddenly, you know, if that gentleman would have seen a Bigfoot, he might have had the same kind of life altering, you know, situation happened to him. Now, the one thing I couldn't find a ton on, but I do want to mention before we're done here this evening, is whenever I think of like lake monsters and serpents throughout history, I always think of the indigenous people and the Native American stories the serpents and like that motif. Again, I don't know enough about that pantheon to understand or talk about it very well, but that's where my brain goes when I hear these old stories like this, especially when you think of the first ones we had about like the French trappers, because they're coming into Iroquois territory and everything. So the only thing I could really find in my search, now I'm sure I would not be shocked if there's more out there, it's just only what I could find. The Iroquois, there was an Iroquois word specifically from the Mohawk. The word is Onyare, Oniare, and the phonetic pronunciation they have next to it is Onyare, which is, I guess, a Mohawk word for snake. Apparently, they said that it is a horned dragon-like snake that breathes poison and fire that used to capsize watercraft and ambush humans. And they apparently would either make offerings to this creature or interact in certain ways. So I couldn't find a ton on that angle, but I bet there is historically, because you have a body of water that big. I'm sure there's some stories about it, at least throughout history, if not from those tribes or people currently. But yeah, I just thought that this was a really interesting thing that I came across. Was shocked that I had never heard of it before. I thought it was going to go in one direction, and it ended up kind of going in another direction, which is why this stuff is so much fun to look into.
Yeah, the South Bay Bessie, when you sent that to me last night, I was so tired that I thought it said South Side Bessie. And I thought, well, this must be some character. And I mean, she is.
So someone out there right now is like, oh my God.
But no, I did enjoy this. But is it something that I think is paranormal? Well, I mean, certainly not those latter stories of the Chomper. I think you're very right to suggest that this very well could be one of those snakeheads, because we know that, I mean, everything fits, right, and we know to be on the lookout for them. The Bessie stories are definitely interesting. The one to me that's most interesting, I mean, it's got to be a toss-up between that one you read from Weird Ohio, with that, again, a guy that we can, if we take everything at face value, we can assume is a pretty knowledgeable of the life under the water.
Right.
It's got to be a toss-up between that one and the one that goes back to the late 18th century. It's it's a real wild one. Now, again, the one thing I will caution, this is something we actually spoke about with Thomas White, is when it comes to old writing and old periodicals especially,
right,
it's good to be a little cautious about taking everything at face value what's written there, because, as I said, a lot of times these, especially animals or crops of unusual size, would be printed almost like native advertising, which was a phrase I could not remember during our conversation, but it was essentially a sneaky ad. Like, come up to Lake Erie, there are 20, 30 foot long fish. Yeah. Like, even if you're not into like, I could eat fish I'd have fish fingers for years. You could entice people to come just to gawk at such a thing. I mean, clearly, out on Lake Erie today, according to our latter story, they're doing that now. So it's got to be a toss-up between those two. But either way, very enjoyable stories. And another thing to look into and to learn about the next time I'm up in Erie, which is going to be in about 2.5 weeks.
There you go. So if any of you out there have a story about Lake Erie, whether about South Bay Bessie, the Lake Erie Chomper, or anything related to Lake Erie, both paranormal or not, if you know some good fishing spots, we want to hear about that too.
If you have memories of the Elephant Bar in Erie, we'd like to hear that.
Right, yeah. So if you would like to share any of those stories with us, you can find us on Facebook and Instagram at The Ghost Furnace, or you can send us an email at theghostfurnacepodcast@gmail.com.
If you know the true origins of Cajun eggs in Erie, get to us immediately.
Stat. Thanks, everyone. Good night.